So that's our today's tech. So what am I want to talk about today? What am I thinking about? Well, I think this is the approach I want to sort of noodle on, this idea of what exactly is a user story. I want to start out by just breaking it down and getting kind of basic, because I think when you sort of break it down and really understand what a user is, at least what they were intending a user to be, and this idea of a story and put a little more meat on that than what we typically see it as a I can kind of thing. And then I want to start saying, well, okay, if those are user stories, what is it that we're actually capturing a lot of? And I think we're capturing a lot of what I'll call right now solution stories. So we want to sort of juxtapose those and say, how are they the same and how are they different? Because one of the things we're going to see is that we got some confusion on just the word user story. What does that actually represent? And then what do we actually end up putting in our tool in Jira or whatever tool we're using, though Jira is by far the most popular tool today. And then we'll have some Q&A and wrap it all up. So that's what I'm thinking about today, and I encourage you to join me and start thinking about it and ask me your questions as we go along. So we're going to start off with this: what is a user? And this is not an actually very easy question, because a user is kind of, it depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on what you're asked to be, what you're being asked to build. If I'm asked to build an entire machine, the users are the users of that machine. If I'm being asked to build a component of that machine, the users are the component of the machine. So when I start saying, someone says, who are our users? The first thing I got to ask is, what are you being asked to build? And so when I think about what you're being asked to build, I like to think about it as a big black box of magic. And here you see I have my big box of magic right here, right? And it's black. It's really dark. You can't see in it. You can't see what it does. It just does magic for me. That is, I ask something of it and it goes, woohoo, here's your response, magic. How it happens is everyone's guess. I like to think there's magical garden gnomes in there who do all this work for me, but it's, as far as I care, it's magic. Only when what comes out doesn't meet my needs do I start caring, going, what's going on in there? But as long as I get what I care about with all the security and safety and everything else I care about, I'm golden. I love it. So I want to be thinking about this big box of magic. Now, a lot of us don't have a big black box of magic. We might have, something inside our box of magic, something like, I make sure my thing right here. I might be working on my blue box of magic and my red box of magic. So from the blues perspective, yeah, I've got that outsider who may be coming in here and saying, yeah, I want something, but I also have red asking me for things and green asking me for things. And I might be asking green for things and red for things, right? And so who are my users depends on what you're asking me to build. Because once I decide what you're asking me to build, whether I'm building the entire big black box or I'm just building the red box, right? I've got to be clear about that, because until I'm clear about that, I do not know my users. I've got to start there. So let's just assume we're going to be doing the black box of magic, the whole thing, or if you want to put your substitute in here, do that. So who are my users? Well, the key thing about users is that users interact. They use, right? Either they use me or I use them. We interact somehow. And when we think of users, we often think about our people up here, right? Are humans, and they're asking something of the black box of magic, or we're asking something of them, right? And these are pretty good. These kind of ones, right? So I'm going to draw a line here. It's like boom, boom, right? These interactions are pretty clear. In fact, I might want to use it for 3 or 4 different things, right? I might have several interactions with this. So these interactions are the ones that are probably the easiest to understand. That we have a human being who's interacting, and that sounds like the word user, right? That sounds like a word user. But we also have interactions with other things that may not be people. They might be those blue box of magic and the red box of magic and the green box of magic. We interact with other systems. We might ask them for something that they need to give us. We want to get value out of them, or they're asking something from us. I think that works perfectly well too. They interact though. Again, the idea is interact, and there's some sort of transaction happening between us. They want something from us, or they're listening to us. They're waiting for us to announce an event, right? Something's going on here. Users interact. But what about these bottom 2 icons here, right? I've got this thing that looks like a bunch of standards, and this is what I'm trying to represent, standards or regulations or something like that, that we have to follow. Are they users? And over here, I have a ball of duct tape to represent all the kludges that we put into this thing, because let's face it, most of us are not actually building new stuff. We're building stuff on top of old stuff, stuff that has all sorts of nasty kludges to it, right? And when we're building that old stuff, what about all those decisions that people have made before us, all the things that we have to live with, all this brownfield stuff? Is that a user too? And I'm going to punt on this. So I'm gonna put a question mark here. I don't think those are actual users. I don't think the standards themselves are a user, and I don't think those kludges are a user. I think what's going on here is that there's something else out here. There's something like here, like a market that I want to go into, and it's that market, right, that I have the interaction with. That's what I have the interaction, and the market invokes the standard, and the standard actually belongs inside my black box of magic. It's the decision about how I'm actually going to build it. It's part of my magic. And the same with the kludges. I think the kludges, somewhere out there, instead of a market, there's some sort of previous system or something like that that we're building on top of all those kludges. And what I want to do is I want to reuse that. I want to build on top of that. That's the choice I'm making. That's what I'm getting value, that system thing. And that happens to have all these kludges in it that, again, I think really come back over here. So while we often want to talk about the standards as being a user, or those systems of brownfield as something we have to interact with, we don't interact with that. What we actually interacting is with this market idea or the system idea, and that's what we're interacting with, and that's what we have to see as our users for our user story. What they do bring to us is that there might be some things that belong in our black box of magic later on. Okay. So users interact. And so we got to finding out who are the things they're using whatever I'm asked to build at this borderline here to interact with this thing. Okay. So that's my idea of who my users are. Users interact. So hopefully you're already starting to pop some questions up there in the question box that we could answer as we go forward, because this is not a cut and dry subject right here. Users are very strange, but we have to decide, are they the primary things they're trying to get value out of me, or value out of them? Because I think when you come right down to it, when we think about users, we want to think about this concept of value. Whoops, that's horrible writing. That's much better, right? Because if we talk about value, I have to be either giving them value or getting value. Just being constrained usually means that I'm trying to get value by going to that market, which is labeling those constraints upon me, those decisions about what I have to build. So that's the idea of a user. The second idea I want to throw out here is, what is a story? Now this is I'm gonna go pretty old school here, right? Because you can see in my definition right here, a story is a narrative that has three aspects to it: a beginning, a middle, or four aspects: a beginning, middle, and end. But it's a container of some kind with a beginning, middle, and end, and it has a context. That container sits somewhere. So that's what we're going to analyze here when we think about what is a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's set in some sort of context. And this is important because we're going to see all these elements captured as we try to say, do we capture a user story? We're going to see how those are captured here in a second. So where do we start? Well, we start at the interaction. And notice how I've drawn and gotten my interactions here. I got interactions to my user person here, which is pretty obvious. We can look at those interactions. I got interactions to other components, which I might do in something like a design to contract process or something like that, where I'm actually driving that thing. I got something to my market here, right, which happens to invoke some standards. And I got happened to my existing containers that I'm working with, existing systems, existing components, some off-the-shelf libraries, right, things that I'm using that have compose some constraints on what I'm building, but it's really that I want to build with this container that comes up with these constraints, right? So I'm gonna start there, and I want to analyze this interaction or this interaction. Say, tell me about the interaction. What are you doing that is getting this concept of value to you, right? What am I giving? Are you getting value from me, which of course the arrow would be that direction, or am I getting value from you, which of course I could put the arrow that direction. And if I'm getting multiple transactions of value, I can draw more lines, right? I'm not stuck with just one line. So start with interaction, and with that interaction, now I'm going to start taking those 3 points. What's my beginning, my middle, and my end, and what is the context? So I want to start pulling that stuff apart. And to do that, I use this little acronym I call a BERI. BERI stands for beginning, end, reason for interaction. So hopefully this is going to give me a lot of things I care about. What's the beginning? What's the end? What's the overall interaction that has value, right? And that's what the reason part is here for. So let me give you a couple examples of what might be a BERI to me, right? A BERI is this idea that when I come up to something and I interact with it, that's the reason I went there for, and I can complete my interaction. I like to think of a cash machine as an example I use quite often. A cash machine, I use it to manage my money. That's really important to me. It's a good reason to interact with a cash machine is to manage my money. And right now, even during the COVID times, I'm actually doing a lot of this from my home. So even my bank system, managing my money is very important. But managing my money doesn't have a clear beginning and end. It keeps going on and on and on. So it's really not a BERI. When I log into my cash machine, when I enter into my banking account to manage my money, I enter my password or PIN. Entering my password and PIN clearly has a good beginning and ending. Really, really clear there. I know when I start doing it, I know when I'm done. But that's not the reason I'm interacting with my banking system, right? That's not a good reason to interact at all. I want to interact for some other reason. And this is an important step, but it's not a BERI. A BERI has all four aspects, beginning, end, and the reason, the value through an interaction. So for a cash machine, maybe withdraw money. Withdraw money has the beginning and end, and it's a reason for interacting. For my online, deposit a check. Beginning and end, reason for interaction. Clear beginning, clear end, reason for interaction. So when I look at these interactions here, I'm looking for those BERIs. I'm looking for those beginning and reason for interaction. That's what I want to name these things here. Okay. And even maybe this thing down here, I want to go to that market. I want to reuse that component, right? That's going to cause me some constraints. But that's what I'm looking for. And I'm looking for these BERIs, the beginning and reason for interaction. Now, that is part of the story here. That's just what I'm doing. I'm depositing a check. But it doesn't do me any good to deposit a check if it gets all the numbers wrong. If I say I deposit a check that's for $300 and it puts $3 in my account, something's gone wrong. Yeah, it deposited the check, but it did it incorrectly. So there's more than just this BERI. This BERI here represents what we call in the requirements world the function or functional. This is something it does. But I have to do that thing fairly well. I need more to this. And that more to this comes from something like ISO 25010. ISO 25010 says, here are, when I do that thing, when I do the BERI, I want to do it this well. I want to be effective, efficient, free from risk. That is, I'm not going to get hosed over. It covers everything I need to do, and I don't hate using it. Right? I actually got a product for my wife years ago, and it was functionally wonderful. It was doing everything that she needed to do, but she hated the interface and she never used it. The interface was just kind of clunky, right? It wasn't that it didn't work. It's just she hated touching it, so it delivered no value. She wouldn't touch it until they upgraded the interface, and I started making a big deal in my courses about it. Then she started using it. Now she uses it all the time. It's delivering tons of value. But it wasn't meeting one of the important ideas here, which is overall satisfaction. Do I like using it? And so this is what it means to say I'm doing something in an acceptable manner, right? And that's, I think, an important word to remember here when you think about is acceptable. When I do that thing, how do I make sure it's acceptable? Well, I know that it's acceptable when I do it effectively, efficiently. I don't hose you over. I have context cover, and there's general satisfaction. That's what makes it really work well. And then that's sort of a lot of what I care about. I've got the function, and I've got some things that make that function acceptable, which we might call acceptance criteria. That means I have to add the third thing here that really makes this thing really fly, is the context. What is going on in this thing? Where is this person doing this BERI, right? So right here, here they are, they're doing the BERI thing with acceptance criteria. They're doing that thing and they're doing it well, but they're within a context because the acceptance criteria often, acceptance criterion often think about what's been happening before, because if this changes, the acceptance criteria might change. The berry probably doesn't change, but the acceptance criteria probably change. And what happens after might change the acceptance criteria. Again, the berry might not change. You still have to do the thing, but what makes that thing acceptable might change based upon what happens before or happens after. Or even who's coming to the party. How much education do they have? How skilled are they? Someone with very high skills might have a different acceptance criteria than someone with very low skills. So I have to understand the context of what's going on around this user. And here I have the person, but I could have the system. I could have a market. I have to understand that. And of course, I've got all the things down here that constrain me overall, right? The things like the standards and the kludges that we put in place. That might even change my acceptance criteria a little bit. But I have to understand that context in order to say what a good user story is. I have the user story doing a thing in an acceptable way within a certain context so I can understand the context. And what's going to be important too, as you get into this a little bit more detail, we're not going to cover it much today, is that this context and understanding can help drive even further decisions and get better, smaller user stories in the future. So that's what we're doing with this context. Now, once I start thinking about this context, this set of things from ISO 25010, the needs view, it's okay, right? It's okay, and I think it's a great definition of sort of overall value. But when I start looking at all this context and all this detail, I want to get more specific. And so then I jump into the ISO 25010's specification view. And this is what I recommend to most of my clients to use as they're driving this forward. And if you were to count quickly here, you would see that there's 31 of these categories on here. 31 different ways we can talk about being acceptable. Now, fortunately, most of these are just don't screw them up. Out of these, there's probably going to be a handful. You know, maybe something about time behavior, something about user error protection, something about recoverability. There's going to be a handful of these that really stand out to say, you know what, we've been doing this thing already. We already do this thing. But the reason we're willing to pay you for a new version of how to do this thing is because you're going to make this thing for me right here a whole lot better. You're going to make it run much faster, or you're going to make it use less of the energy that I want, or you can do more throughput or something I actually care about deeply. You're going to do something better than I could do before. I could already do the berry. That's the thing about the berries. The functions, they almost always exist already. But how well you do those, that's a big deal. And so the berry here becomes really, really important. And so I like to go down and get a little bit more detail. And so I encourage my clients to say, find the handful of these things. And I think that handful is somewhere in the 5 to 7 range on the average, maybe 12 at the very top, right? Down the bottom, 1 maybe. But so you know, we're talking a handful of these sets of script that really stand out, that people will make the value judgment on, that you actually deliver something they care about. So now my user story is really starting to shape up. I've got users, those things that interact, those are the berry, those interactions, doing that in an acceptable way, which I can actually define using something like ISO 25010 to say, here are the criterion by which I'm going to judge when you do that thing, it's actually something acceptable. Okay. Hopefully we're doing well so far. So if my user story is that berry with the acceptance criteria set in a context, so doesn't that sound like what I'm talking about, a solution story? And this is a problem because those people that we talk to, especially if they're human beings or even look at system documentation, what they're going to give us is either user stories or what I call a solution story. They often give us both at the same time. In fact, they often will want to start with the idea of solution stories, and then we have to work them to tell us what problem they're solving. What are they actually trying to do with it? Because they love to tell us about the solution. And the same source is telling us all these things. And so we're going to have to figure out some way to split these things up. And so one of the things that I've been really working with my clients a lot with lately is this idea of talking about story types. And I've been drawing a picture of something like this recently. And you see this picture has two big things. First of all, it has a column here that talks about what problems we solve, and a column here about how are we going to actually solve it. Now, my big black box of magic should resolve something like over here. This is where my box of magic should be. What have you asked me to build? This should be this column. So if my black box is here, my users should be over here. So for our little class right now, we're going to call these user stories and these solution stories. So we've got two different versions here. And then it all, again, depends on my black box of magic. If I say, yep, what have you asked me to solve, I'll make decisions. Now, what's also interesting here is that there's these different layers of decisions that you see here, these different sort of colors. We make decisions that affect the whole problem. For example, I'm working with a client right now, and we're working on a machine that does tests to see if you have COVID, right? And the whole problem is we need to know if you have COVID. So if a decision or a story affects everything about how we try to figure out how you have COVID, then it belongs up in this zone. But what if it's only affecting the result display? Well, the result display might be an increment or a small amount of what that problem is. What if it's just about intake of the sample, or one small thing like, how do I label the sample? One little bit. Well, it might be down here. So we could talk about that problem in the whole, an increment, or a bit. In the same way, we could talk about the solution as a whole. Like we may make architecture choices, right? The architecture may be up here, and that might be something. Or we might have components here. And down here, we might have a class or a method. Right? We can make stories about those at those levels too. So one thing to think about is we have these two basic story types. We have stories that talk about the problem, right? And the problem is always that thing outside my black box of magic. Okay. So all this really depends on that black box of magic and knowing where your boundary is. Now, let's be honest. It's not always a black box, right? It's often more a transparent box of magic. That is, people kind of already know what's going on in there. In fact, we could say this sort of belongs in there and that belongs in there, potentially, right? Because that's kind of things we have to do to figure out all the solution bits. It's a transparency box. And what's happened because it's transparent, while we know that the standards probably belong here, the user starts getting in here too, and all the solutions. They're saying, oh, we want you to build me this. And they often ask for a thing that we call, that everyone else calls features, right? And my features, while they get mentioned out here, really belong in there. Features are solutions that we come up with to allow someone to do the thing that they want to do, right? To allow them to do that thing. And so features belong in, and they'll start with us with features. They'll start telling us this feature and say, my user story is, as a user, as myself out here, I want one of these. I need one of these things. I'm like, well, okay, I understand that's what you think you need. And here's where the smart person was going to say, tell me a little bit about the context you're using it. Tell me what's going to go on. Tell me what you're trying to accomplish when you use this feature, so we understand this feature even better. And try to get back here and understand what this really is, so we understand what that user need is. Because it turns out this part out here is really easy to break down. If we want to do more incremental, faster releases, this is where we need to focus on. Breaking down features can be really, really, really hard. I was just having a discussion today about breaking down a feature, and this person says, you know, I've had a lot of experience that I don't know how you break that feature down. And I says, well, here's the way we could do it if we start looking at the workflow again. If we go back out to here, we can find that we only need a part of that feature to get through that. We don't need all the feature at that point to do that one step of the workflow. They're like, yeah, that's probably true. But to build the entire feature, that's hard. To build a little piece of it to support one step of a workflow or interaction, that's actually much more doable. So we need to find out where that boundary is and take things that they start with, the features, and then go back out and understand what this is out here to try to go back to our user stories. Because so much of what we have are what I'm calling solution stories. There are people, the stories that come up with that say, I want this feature or I want that feature, because that's how they know to talk to us, because this is not a black box. Really, it's a transparent box of not magic. We know exactly how this is working. So my pattern, how I get my user stories, how I actually get my user stories, my solution story, is that I'll start with my solution story. Tell me what your solution is, because they want to tell me anyhow. They're dying to tell me. They're aching to tell me. They really want me to know what solution I'm thinking of. And then once I understand that solution story, then I'll use the old, what we call in business, the one variation of the why question, or the 5 whys, to go from here down to here, right? And then I'll try to understand the user story, which is talking about what are they trying to accomplish. They're not trying to accomplish a feature. No one's trying to accomplish spell check. They're trying to write a document that doesn't have spelling errors, because that's one of their acceptance criteria, is that it looks and spelled correctly. It doesn't drop the T in development when you change it from one medium to another. Jerky program, right? And so that's where we're trying to go. And so we'll ask some variation why. And then once we've got that, then we're going to be looking at improving it primarily through the acceptance criteria, making sure those are measurable and testable, and that they can turn into acceptance tests relatively easily. So that's how I'm going to build my stories up. I'm going to start out with the solution, move down to the problem, and then improve that problem over time. And I can get a lot of these things through things like context diagrams and the like. So that really helps me build those things up. Okay. So what are we going so far? We cited that a user story is something where a user interacts with my black box of magic. But it's really not a black box of magic. It's a transparent box. So they're going to give me a solution story. I'll go back and ask the question why to try to understand that problem. And when I do, I'll try to set that into context, which helps me determine what the acceptance criteria or the acceptable factors are that say, when I do that thing, yes, you've delivered value for me. So finally, what the heck do we end up putting in Jira? What actually belongs in this tool, or in your Azure DevOps, or a 3x5 card, or whatever other tool you had to be using? Excel, I just saw, was a reasonably high-ranked tool for this kind of stuff. So what actually goes in there? Well, let's take a look. Right. One of the things we have to be careful of here is the difference between the user story and the user story template. The user story, as we saw, was first introduced with this idea with the 3x5 cards, right? That had a front and a back. And on the front and the back, it captured certain things. But it was not the user story. It was a template for a user story template that captured a lot of it. And so the early Agile people would say, this isn't a story, this is a placeholder. Because what we have here is only 2/3 of the things we've been talking about. Yeah, we've got the function here. Got that, looking good. Hopefully at some point that's going to be a berry level thing that we can then decompose down so we get something that fits in our sprint. We got the acceptance criteria down here. Beautiful, we've got that. But the user story template doesn't have a context, right? Doesn't have the context. And that's why we heard all these people saying it's a placeholder, because it's only 2/3 of what we really care about. We've got the function, we got acceptance criteria, but we haven't got the context. We haven't got all that stuff surrounding it that helps me understand it so I can make lots of other decisions and make sure the acceptance criteria are really what we care about. And noticing that when we change the context slightly, that these acceptance criteria down here may be modified. Right. So what do I put in Jira so far? Well, I got a place for this in Jira. That's pretty good. I kind of sort of have a place for the acceptance criteria. Now, what I actually have typically is a big box that says acceptance criteria on it, where I can type away whatever I darn well want. I've got a lot of clients now trying to find a better way so I can have individual acceptance criteria in its own field, so it could have its own life cycle rather than having 4 or 5 or 6 of these shoved into one big old box. Trying to create an object that has its own in definition, in review, completed, right, accepted. Because you can see each one of these, if you look at these kind of definitions, are really going to drive the cost and duration of this project. So you want to actually have some level of control over them potentially. That you don't want them randomly changing right and left, because that's going to change your entire design and approach. So having them in one big box, they're like, I do have a place to put them, but they're not really where I want to. Whereas this tends to think I got a name place, I got places for estimates, beautiful. But I usually just have a box of some kind to put my acceptance criteria. But at least I have a place for those in Jira. But where do I put the context? Where do I put all that contextual stuff that makes this a complete story? Because the user story has to have the function, the acceptance criteria, and that context with it. Remember, story beginning, middle, and end within a context. Well, we don't have one. Let's be honest. Our tools do not give us one. So what are we stuck with? Well, for our context, well, if we're running Scrum and other Agile techniques, we're relying on our product owner to be the human being container. That's our container. It's the human being who's going around and telling the story over and over again. I always liken the product owner sometimes to be like your old senile grandfather, the person who told you the same story over and over again. I have an elderly gentleman, not my grandfather, unfortunately, but an elderly gentleman I'm well acquainted with. And he must have told me about a dozen times just in the last year how he helped design certain lighting fixtures over our local freeway because he was on the transportation, state transportation team. And I'm like, yeah, those are the lights you helped design. Got it. Right? And you try to pretend to be interested on the even 10th or 12th time. Yeah, that's what the product owners are going to be doing here. They're going to tell you about that context over and over again so you know that context as well as yourself. What if we don't have this? What if we don't have a product owner or our product owner's in the wrong place? Well, then we're relying, have to go back to something else over here. I had one client I was working with and we wrote use cases. Because use cases are sort of the grandfather of user stories. They contain a lot of the same content, but they give a lot more context than a user story does. It's designed to capture more of that context, the flow, what happens before, what happens after, who they are, right? We could add all this special stuff to a use case. We're also going to be creating personas to supplement this context. Personas talk about that who quite a lot, their objectives, their goals, what do they know, where do they come from? Right? What do they do for their own entertainment? So we have to create more physical things if we don't have our friend, the PO, to tell us all that in real time when we need it, right? So we don't have a place for this in Jira. We can put this kind of stuff as attachments in Jira, but no one ever really kind of does. They don't want to write them. We really want to rely on this PO. So that means that PO needs to be that living container that has those conversations with our stakeholders. And the other thing to think about when we're using a Jira, or especially in Azure DevOps, or if you're playing with Safe or something like that, one of the things they talked about when we put this in here is that they might have a hierarchy of some kind. And the hierarchy they like to talk is epic feature story task. Now, I gotta admit, when I first saw this, my heart just started beating wildly because I had conversations with some people at Microsoft a decade and a half ago when they were just start putting the first Agile templates into Team Foundation Server at the time. And the story they told me, though this may be urban legend, so don't take it too seriously, but the story they told me was they wanted everyone to customize their Agile template. And they knew that people were usually just going to take the template as is and just use it. And they wanted to make sure that people customize it. So they said, can we come up with the most asinine breakdown possible with epic feature story task? Because if we do that, then people were going to do it because epics do not break down into features. Features do not break down into stories. Stories do not break down into tasks. They're two different animals. They said, okay, but so that will force people to customize. And no one did. So how do we actually use this? Because our Jira tools, our Azure DevOps tools are going to have epic feature story tasks. Which one goes into where? Well, we could actually solve this if we use our little map that we had. So we've placed those on our map. This is a much better hierarchy. And this is how we actually want to work it. We want to write our epics. And we want to say, okay, here's our epic. And it's about the problem. This is an epic user story, right? Because it's talking about what the users want to do. And it's too big to fit. So it talks about the whole thing. And we'll want to break those down into stories, smaller stories that we get into sprints. However, we want to respond to that with a feature, saying a feature is going to help us solve one or more epics. An epic will be solved by one or more features, right? So between these two sides, there's a many-to-many. And it's really good to go like this zigzag pattern. Epic, start thinking about the features, because the moment we start thinking about the features, we're going to introduce new problems that we need these stories to help us solve, right? As we come up with new solutions, they generate new problems, right? So doing it zigzag actually makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make sense as a straight hierarchy. So when we're thinking about what do we put in our tools, what exactly is a user story, these are going to be our user stories, either epic in size or fit in size. And these are going to be our designs and solutions that we're going to actually build to solve something. They're going to be our solution stories. Do we put our solution stories in the backlog? Sure, if you want to. I don't really seem to mind. However, you want to be careful with not getting too far out in front of with these to the most part, because there are solutions and we want to do those just in time as possible, whereas these are pretty stable. Our epics and stories over here, let me flip that out and flip that. Our epics and stories here are pretty stable, that they're not going to change radically over time. Okay. So that's my take. Simple, straightforward, trying to make it so it's not too complex here, but what exactly is a user story? So with that, I'm ready to answer some questions that you may have and really sort of dive into particular instances and see if you can play Stump the Earl on things. Oh, did I mention it was Bow Tie Tuesday, by the way, too? I should have mentioned that earlier, because every Tuesday I wear a bow tie just so I can say, hey, one day of the week during COVID is different than all the other days for one reason, because I get to wear a tie that day. So you caught me on Bow Tie Tuesday. So Jesse, did I allow any questions or did I just stump them with my incredible orientation?
Earl, you've gotten a few questions here, some from the very beginning of the presentation and some towards the end. So I'll go ahead and start asking you a few of them.
Okay.
First question here is, can a user change depending on what level the team is working at? One day they are talking about the black box and the next day they are at the blue box level.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question is, let's just sort of draw this up here, and because that's exactly what you're saying, right? So one day we're sitting out here and we're at black box level, right? And I have users out here, and I'll just draw them as people to be simple, but they could be systems or anything. And then next day, I'm taking the blue box that's sitting inside that box, right? And I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna pull it out, and we're just gonna talk about that. And it turns out that black box outside of that is a red box that we had. There's an orange box out here, and there's still those other people. And so, yeah, one day I'm talking about this stuff, and the next day I'm talking about that one and that one and that one, because now I'm talking about the blue box. Now, this is really, really important. And that's why whenever I get into any of those kind of conversations with my clients, I always start and say, tell me about the context we're talking about right now. I always want to start with the conversation saying, what are we talking? Are we talking about just the blue box right now? Or are we talking about the black box? Because the interaction, even this human being, if I talk about the interaction with the black box, it's going to be often a whole berry, right? So let me give you an example here. I was working with a client recently, and they have a black box level thing, which is run a test. So they put samples in. I told you about testing for COVID. They put samples in, run a test, get output, right? That's the berry. Put samples in, get a result. However, when we talk about the display panel, that's my blue thing down here, just the display panel, they never run a test with the display panel. They enter a sample ID. That's it. And then this display panel then sends a sample ID to this thing, it sends it to that thing, it starts all sorts of other processes going, but that's their interaction with the blue thing. It's a different sort of berry-ish kind of thing. That's all they want with the blue. That's a value interaction with the blue. That's all they want to do with the berry thing. That's their reason for interacting with the blue thing. Right. So yeah, the berries can change a little bit. The interaction can change as you change your users. So great question.
All right, Earl, the next question. How do I tell the story if my product owner is in one city and my development team is in another?
Yeah, I actually had that with a client. Their product owner was in Arizona and the developers were in the Ukraine, right? Almost about as far away as you can get. Right? That was not quite 12 hours, but it was close to 9 to 10 hour difference. And the overlap was almost non-existent and no one wanted to get up early or stay up late. So what did we do? So what they first tried was just writing the simple user story template, the function, the acceptance criteria. Let's just send that on over. And unfortunately, what they were getting was development garbage. They weren't getting anything. So what I had them do, and as I suggested in my early one, I had them start writing use cases and creating little videos of the product owner telling it, rather than just having the live interaction, but telling the story of that thing. And having a little script that they went through saying, here are the people, here's what they know, and record videos that they could play back at will. So they had to find substitutes for that human being interaction. Your best case is to go, first of all, fly that product owner to that development team for a while. Can't do that right now as much as we'd like, but have them know that person as an individual first so they can start making sure they understand them better and can help decipher some of what they're saying. But the idea of using use cases and using those use cases as a way to start setting small snippets of video that describe and talk about these things really help that client. They started getting working software back. But you're going to have to find some sort of substitute for that because the context is critically important. And without it, what we see over and over again are people are having issues when breaking things because they didn't understand how it's actually being used.
All right, Earl, here's another question. Do stories clearly distinguish between a requirement, a design, or some of both?
So here's the idea, the story itself, the whole idea of a story, the beginning, end, and beginning and reason for action by Barry. The whole idea of a story here is that it doesn't really care about the problem or the solution. You could have stories on either one, right? And we can tell contextual things about my design, and that all makes sense. What makes it really about a requirement or a design is where you sit on the box, right? So we're back here with our box picture again. If it's inside the box, it's solution by definition. If I shrink the box, something that was here inside my box solution for the black box could be problem for my blue box. That was cute. It looks like I've got a little delay kind of kicking in now and then, right? What is solution for my black box is a problem for my blue box. And this is why requirements, I like to joke when I'm teaching requirements to people, you might as well start becoming a drunkard, right? You might as well take up drinking because you're just going to go nuts. This is a crazy field. That something that is a solution design here is a problem over here. And that happens all the time. It's the same exact thing. It just changes its nature because I changed what I was talking about. I changed my context. I changed the solution box that I'm building. The example I use in my classes is that if I'm building a house, the floor is certainly a design choice. How strong I make that floor, how big I make that floor. But if I'm just the mason putting in the fireplace, how strong the floor was is one of my problems now. It's not a design because all I'm doing is the fireplace. I'm not designing the house, I'm just doing the fireplace. And how strong they made the floor will limit me on what kind of fireplaces I can probably put in. I can't maybe use a heavy stone one, I'll have to put a light steel one in or something. So what makes the difference, and this is where we go back and start with that conversation, what have you asked me to build? What is the thing that you're asking me to do? Because that's going to help me draw the line between what a requirement is and what a design or solution is. And the thing itself, that little bit that says the floor is this strong, or we're using this method or class, or we're using this language, those little bit things are what I call space agnostic. They can live in either, right? In fact, one of my favorite little fibs is if you're a Douglas Adams fan, you know that everything on Earth is just a solution to the problem. What is the ultimate question? We're a big what is the question whose ultimate answer is 42? The Earth and everything in it has just been built as a solution to try to figure out what the ultimate question was. Of course, virtually we get blown up before a galactic highway just before we find the answer, right? So, yes, this is a tough one, but you have to start with what you've been asked to deal with and then try to figure out solutions from there.
Thanks, Earl. Here's another one. Where do we document complex business rules, especially ones that inform multiple stories?
So that's a great question. And there's a couple places we could do it. Of course, in the most agilist ways, right? We're going to see those as part of the context that the human being product owner is supposed to tell the team as they're designing it and building it and saying, remember, these are the rules that we have to follow. These are the ones that enforce blah, 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 blah. What if we don't have and don't want to rely on the memory of the product owner? This is where we have the notes section a little bit on the template that could help us. But mostly what I'm going to do is I capture almost all those business rules in my world. When I do this, I create a data model, an interrelationship diagram type thing. A class model, light version of a class model can do this too. Those are excellent at capturing business rules. Those state diagrams will capture almost all your complex business rules. And if you still have those, you can have activity models with state changes. So a good product owner, in my opinion, this is Earl opinion right here, a good product owner is an excellent business analyst modeler. They're going to be breaking out context models to get that border really clear so you can see the context model. They're going to be using use cases to talk about berries and how they're going to break them down to make sure they don't forget something. They're going to use use case as their memory tool. They're going to use data models to talk about complex business rules and what information content they want to remember. They're going to use state diagrams to talk about more complex business rules about how things change from one state to another. And they're going to use activity diagrams. Some people like to use sequence diagrams, but I find that if you're working with human beings, not developers, activity models are much more understood and capture roughly for the sake of requirements work the exact same area. So they're going to be really good in those 5 kinds of models. And if they're using those, they're going to capture everything they need and they'll have that context in the models and in their conversation and in the little stuff that we can stick in Jira, everything they need to make it happen.
Okay, Earl, how important is it to classify the story as a whole and increment/bit? As in, how much time do you spend arguing where it fits?
I actually don't spend a ton of time arguing where it fits because then, for the most part, my organizations have found once we draw that context diagram, right? Again, really define in these pictures what my boundary is, then the rest of it becomes pretty straightforward. Right? They say, oh, is it about all of this or some of it? And if someone's not quite sure, we just say it's all of it, right? Because I can't hurt being bigger, because I'm going to have to break it down. What really matters is later on is does it fit in a sprint, right? That's what we come down to, because we only break it down till it fits. And so if you're running 2-week sprints and the whole thing fits, I'm not going to break it down. If it doesn't fit, I break it down to just something more incremental to deliver within 2 weeks. And I usually break it down by the workflow or by the type, different types. Like if I'm doing a bank system, I might break it down by checking accounts versus savings account versus money market accounts. Or if it's a bank system, I make a break down a workflow of how do I deposit a check or open an account, right? Look at the steps there. But I only break it down when I have to break it down to be able to fit it into a sprint.
All right, next question, Earl. Why are use cases the grandfathers of user stories?
Why are use cases the grandfather user story? I love that question. If you're a fan of Gilb did a bunch of this stuff. Capers Jones wrote a great book on this stuff. But if you look at a use case, the first field you have is a name. And it's a use case is a textual model, and the name is a verb noun, which amazingly enough is exactly the way we want to format the name on a user story. Do something, do this, do that, right? And then the next big field is a description, which started as a free text field, where you describe in more than a couple words how this actually works. And amazing enough, exactly the same for a user story, right? And then it had some things that user stories don't have. It had a pre and post conditions. And then it had its courses, right? But this part up here, this part was really, really useful. And I'm gonna give Kent Beck the credit. He saw that, and then he took all that and he married that up with other work that Tom Gilb had done with a thing called Planguage. And in Planguage, P-L-A-N, that's an A, G-U-A-G-E, and a thing called Planguage, he talked about those ISO 250-like categories. ISO 25010 categories that we talked about in the thing. And so he said, oh, if I take this stuff up here, right, plus I added this stuff down here, I can lighten and skip all this stuff because I don't need it right away, right? And that was, to me, the base of the user story. So this, how I said, the name description of a berry interaction, something, because the whole idea of a use case was a interaction with the system that delivers value to the user. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because a user story is supposed to be something, an interaction with the system that delivers value to the user, a use case, right? So user story, use case, they're basically they come from the same stock. Use cases were around when user stories were invented, and I give Kent Beth credit by adding some stuff from Tom Gill's language to write the acceptance criteria in a way that are measurable, testable, and usable.
Earl, next question. How do I put more story content into Jira than just the user story template?
And that's a great one. You know what? I think for me, the best way is to attach video files. Everyone has a mobile phone now that can record video. Just have that PO or whatever say, hey, let me just tell you about this thing, and take a few moments to talk their way through it so that okay. So that it's easier for that person to understand it. So because if you use the video, that brings out the tonality and a lot more content. And what you want to do maybe on that video is give the person a little bit of a script, just a tiny bit of a script, so that they can cover the same territory over and over again. Say, tell me what happens before this, tell me what happens right after this, tell me that thing. Because recording a video is not difficult for a lot of things. If you say to them to go write it out, or if you don't know the 5 models, become expert in the 5 models, that's not going to happen. But if you say, hey, here's a little script, tell me what happens sort of before, what happens after, who these people are, record that in a 5-minute video or 7-minute video, and then attach that video file to Jira, I think that's a much simpler solution.
All right, Earl, the next question. Is there a clear delineation between a user story and a use case? For example, is there more structure and formality in the use case?
Yeah, a lot more structure formality. What the use case is going to add right here is this middle stuff, the pre and the post conditions and the courses, which a user story doesn't have. So basically, a use case starts breaking it down. And one of the more important courses is the exception course. What happens when things go wrong? I mean, really wrong that you cannot get through the entire course. You cannot deliver any value, but how do you fail well, right? Which use cases you have to start writing another user story about when I fail, or remember to do that. More often, you have to remember to do that during design. So when you get a user story into a sprint, it's not just building the story, it's also building enough protection around that user story so that when things fail, you fail well. Right, so it's a little bit tougher, but the use case had a lot more content. That's why I suggest to product owners, especially when you have to break things down to 2-week sprints, I suggest strongly to product owners that they use use cases as a tool to make sure they're always delivering value. Because as you break down these user stories, it's so easy to focus on one step or one part of an overall workflow. They never deliver the actual workflow that's a valuable thing. Right? It's so easy to focus on enter PIN and entering in that security of that PIN perfect, but forget that the whole reason that you're entering the PIN is because you want to get money out of the cash machine. You never actually get the money, but you're great at entering the PIN, right? Whereas the product owner should be always focused on, okay, PIN, great, love it, but we're here to get money out of the cash machine and debit the account.
All right, Earl, people are still trying to stump you with questions, so we'll move on to the next one. What's the relationship between user stories and product backlog items? Are backlog items the solution stories?
So the backlog, one of the things I want people to understand is that your backlog should naturally divide into 3 zones. And the 3 zones, I call them the high time investment. So you're investing a lot of your time, a high amount of your time here, a low amount of your time, and a no amount of your time. Down here in this blue area, all these, and the generic term being PBIs, I can write a P better, PBI, product backlog items. The most common form are the user stories. User stories and epics live down here all the time. As they get brought into here, we're getting into a ready state. Ready state means that they're ready to be pulled into a sprint. At this point, my user stories may start turning into solution stories. That is, that as the team breaks it down to fit, because I'm mostly having the team doing the breaking it down. So one big story here ends up as 6 little stories up here because it was too big to fit, right? If 1 or 2 of those end up being solution stories because that's what the team wrote to help break it apart, fine. right? And so in the backlog, I may have both, but I want to make sure that every solution that I have in there is actually solving some real problem. I do not want solution stories that aren't solving a problem for me, because if they are, that means I'm building something that no one really will use because it doesn't actually solve any real problem. So yes, I will have both types, mostly only seeing the solution stories hopefully at the top. If I have a solution story that's down here, I'll make it in red. Right, put a big S on it, and it's down here in the low investment zone. I'm going to look at that product owner and say, okay, that's a feature. Tell us, we need to understand more of the problem that's solving. Go up and help us understand the user story behind that. So when we build it right. Let me give you a quick example of that. If I said I need a car that goes 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, that's a solution story. You're telling me exactly how that car is supposed to operate. The question is, why does it go to 0 to 60 in 5 seconds or 4 seconds or 3 seconds? Because it could be that you want it to go 0 to 60 in the 3 seconds because you want to show off in front of your friends. Well, if that's the case, if the problem is you want to show off in front of your friends, I'm going to put big old mag wheels on it. I'm going to draw flames on it. I'm going to give a big loud engine. I'm going to make that thing just rock. However, if you wanted to go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds because you want to outrun the police, well, that's a different problem. And in that case, I'm going to make it bland. I'll make it so it's super quiet, bland, that it can just be sort of disappear on the street because you're trying to outrun the police. Putting big old flames and making it loud will just make you stand out. That'd be a total horrible solution, even though it's actually doing the 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. So I want to make sure I understand that problem. So when I do solve it and maybe do exactly what you said in that solution story, I want to make sure I'm solving it in a way that I actually say, yes, that solves my problem.
All right, we've reached the hour mark here, Earl, with all those questions. Thank you for the presentation, and to all of our attendees, thank you for joining us today and contributing with those questions. If you have others or would like to know more about how Construx can help you with user stories, feel free to reach out to me personally. We look forward to seeing you next time at our next webinar, and thank you again, Earl, for the excellent presentation and Q&A session.
You're welcome. And everyone, have a great day. And you always can drop Jesse a line or me a line or hello at a line, and we'll be happy to chat with you. Enjoy.